13, verses 1 through 3 and 18 through 22. Lo, my eye have seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What do you know? I also know. I am not inferior to you. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. And then, behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be vindicated. Who is there that will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. Only grant two things to me, that I will not hide myself from thy face. Withdraw thy hand far from me, and let not dread of thee terrify me. Then call, and I will answer. Or let me speak, and do thou reply to me. Thus ends the reading of the word. Thanks be to God.
When we left Job in chapter 7 last week, he was upset at what he saw as God constantly picking on him with no justification. He was still proclaiming that he was innocent of any wrongdoing, and he wanted God to just leave him alone. Before going into this morning's passage, I want to do a brief summary of what we skipped over when we left Job in chapter 7 and now picking him back up in chapter 13. In chapter 8, we are introduced to Job's second friend, a guy named Bildad. He is upset that Job is attacking the Almighty and questions Job as to whether or not what Job is really saying is that God perverts justice. In other words, that God is an unjust God. Bildad then goes on to remind Job of what we have called the retribution principle, and that God protects the blameless. Remember, the retribution principle says it's easy to figure God out. He rewards good behavior, and he punishes bad behavior. With that being the case, Bildad argues, if Job was as innocent as he claims to be, God would be coming to his defense. Job, if you're suffering, you can't be as innocent as you're claiming to be, would be Bildad's defense. In chapters 9 and 10, Job responds to Bildad. He admits that, yes, God is far greater than anything a human can fathom. He also continues by conceding that if God and a human were to get into an argument, the man would win maybe 1 in every 1,000 times. He also concedes that if God responded to a request for a lawsuit, the man would become crushed. However, Job still has a problem. He's getting to the point where he is questioning whether the retribution principle is accurate. He has come to the realization that, contrary to what he and his 3 friends have thought, the retribution principle doesn't explain God. After all, the righteous suffer and the wicked sometimes succeed. I'm sure all of us have had times where we look and we go, wait a minute, Lord, I do everything right and I'm now suffering, whereas this person over there has totally violated every law you have created, and they're succeeding. How is that fair? Job is at that point. He's not understanding God's version of justice. In chapter 11, we hear from Job's third friend, a guy named Zophar. He is shocked by the words that he is hearing from Job. After all, Job has this reputation of being such a righteous man, and now he's questioning the Almighty. Yet instead of repeating the arguments that the first two friends have already presented, Zophar just says, you know what, Job? I wish God would open his mouth and set you straight. Keep that wish in mind, because next weekend, the first week of April, our last 2 weeks of this series, God will open his mouth. Finally, Zophar tells Job, you know what, Job? I don't know what sin you have, but whatever sin you have, just let go of it. Even now, God can forgive you, and then once he forgives you, he will restore the joy that you once experienced. We then get to chapters 12 and 13, and Job responds to Zophar. He starts off by telling his friends that he knows everything they know. He's not ignorant. After a long diatribe about how it's easy for those who are living in comfort and have contempt for those who are afflicted, he once again reaffirms the power of God. Then as we get to chapter 13, Job once again declares he has seen how the Almighty works. He has also heard reports and understood those reports of how God acts. Then moving to verse 2, he once again reasserts that he is just as knowledgeable of God as his three friends. Then we get to verse 3. This is where the real shock comes in. After admitting in chapter 9 that a man has no chance in presenting a case against God, Job declares, I desire to speak with the Almighty and to argue my case with God. What Job has just done in modern parlance is he's gone to the court clerk and has taken out a complaint form and is filling out the paperwork to sue God. Now, the first time I preached on this passage, I was in California, and my oldest daughter, who would later go on to law school, was an undergrad at Chico State. She was home that Sunday that I was preaching this passage, and she looked at the bulletin that morning, saw what my sermon title was for that morning, and that morning I decided to make it God be Yahweh, Yahweh being the Hebrew word that nobody pronounces for the Almighty. And she comes up to me and goes, Dad, you can't sue God. Well, as I told her after that, I'll tell you, watch and learn, because Job is going to do what can't be done, and he is issuing a legal challenge to the creator of the universe. Job has reached the point where, even though he had earlier stated that a man could not answer God once in 1,000 times, he figures, I have nothing to lose, I'm taking that gamble. In verses 4 through 17, which we skipped, Job directly addresses his three friends and is downright insulting. As I read those passages in preparation for this morning's message, it made me flash back to my days of an undergraduate student studying political science, and every now and then I had to read the congressional record to get information for my papers. And one thing that I love is how the congressmen have a way of insulting people and yet using words that sound like they might be kind of fun. Sort of like, my good friend, Senator so-and-so. Well, you know if they start off my good friend, it's going to be my good friend the idiot. And, you know, I sort of enjoyed reading it. Maybe if you like to see how to insult people biblically, this afternoon you might want to read verses 4 through 17. But what Job says is for you guys, my friends, if you were silent, you would demonstrate your knowledge. Put another way, I think Job is telling his friends, it's better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. In response to Zophar, he even claims, you know what, Zophar, you want God to open his mouth? Yeah, I do too. God, open your mouth and set my three friends straight. Then we get to verse 18. Job declares that he has his case prepared. He is sure that he will be vindicated. Then in the next verse he goes further and says, if anyone could bring a case against me, I would be silent and die. Now, as I consider these two arguments, two thoughts come into my mind. The first one is, okay, you just sued the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Who in the world is going to be crazy enough to either judge that case or be on the jury? After all, I could just see it. Reverend Niccolls, do you have any opinions about God's justice? Your Honor, yes I do. And Job's attorney would dismiss me from the jury pool right away. And I don't think anybody would want to be in the position of judging God. The other thing that I considered was Job's claim that if anybody could bring a claim against him, he would be quiet and just die. As I look at that, I'm thinking of, I could probably fill 5 pages of former students who could bring a charge against me if I ever was in that position. So I have to give Job a lot of credit. I'm not sure he's smart in suing God, but I have to admire his bravado. Then in the last 3 verses, Job lays out his pretrial motions. His first request is that God withdraw his hand as far from him as possible. Remember, Job believes that his troubles are all because the hand of God is against him. He's asking God, for this trial, just take your hand of affliction away from me, so that way you don't totally wipe me out. And then the other request that he has is, God, stop using your might to terrorize me. Job is suffering, and he knows that God could even do worse if the Almighty so desired. Job wants to challenge God, but by the same token, he wants to make sure that God gives him a chance to have a fair trial. Job goes on to say, God, if you agree to these 2 motions, I'm willing to stand up to you and face you face to face. In verse 22, we see how trials in the ancient times were quite a bit different than what we are accustomed to today. In our trials, one side is clearly the plaintiff and is the one making the accusations against the other party. However, in ancient times, their trials were more fluid. One party could start off as the plaintiff and then switch to being defendant, and vice versa. Job is saying, I don't care if you want me to be the plaintiff or the defendant. I just want a chance to face God in court and prove that I am righteous and that my suffering is unjustified. In this chapter, we see Job finally moving from silent suffering to taking action because of his pain. I know most of us do not like pain. However, sometimes pain is necessary to move us on. As I mentioned before, I graduated from Chico State with a degree in political science. When I started my college career, I was thinking I was going on to law school. By the start of my senior year, I looked at my 2-something GPA and realized, especially in California, there was no way I was going into a good law school with that GPA. And with the number of attorneys out there, I didn't want to try to get a job with a 2nd or 3rd class law school degree going up against those who had their law degrees from Stanford and Cal Berkeley. So I was trying to figure out, what does a poli-sci major do when he realizes law school is not an option? Through a series of events that I won't get into this morning, I was convinced to go back to school and get my teaching credential. However, as I was doing that, in the back of my mind, I always thought, you know, I really think being a minister would be fun, but oh wait, PCUSA demands that any pastor pass Greek and Hebrew, and all that I had to do was look at my Spanish 2 grade and realize that wasn't going to happen. However, about 15 years into my career as a teacher, I was in a teaching situation that was terrible. To be honest with you, the only thing that my principal and I could agree on is her best day of work was when I was absent, and the best 2 weeks that I ever had was when she got married and was on a honeymoon. And I was like, Lord, how am I going to survive another 15 to 20 years of this? It was through this pain and a series of events that, looking back on it, I know were orchestrated by God, that I finally felt God pick me up and say, you have 1 or 2 options. Pass Greek and Hebrew, or spend the next 15 to 20 years suffering here. Needless to say, I decided to try Greek and Hebrew, and surprise, surprise, with God's help, I made it through those 2 classes. But it took God putting me in a time of discomfort and pain before I was willing to move on to the next chapter of my life that God wanted me to embark on. When we are going through pain, sometimes the pain is the impetus to get us to move out of the rut that we are in. My friends, if you are feeling some discomfort, or maybe even some pain, perhaps it is God trying to tell you it is time to move on to a different chapter in your life. I would challenge each one of us to take time this week and ask God if there is a change that He wants to see in our life. Perhaps God wants you to move individually to a new chapter of your life. Perhaps God might even tell us as a group that it's time for First Presbyterian Saratoga to change course. Whatever God tells us, let us be open to the moving of the Holy Spirit, especially if we find ourselves in a season of suffering, much as Job has. Amen.
Amen.